Good evening. I'm Alex Truth.
And I'm Maya Clarity. Welcome to Truth Report. Tonight, we're bringing you 5 whistleblower stories that expose a disturbing pattern, one that connects violent extremist organizations operating with impunity on American soil, federal agents executing citizens in broad daylight, billion-dollar corporate welfare schemes disguising themselves as ranching subsidies, and international sanctions violations that reveal how autocrats are already carving up Ukraine while American officials look the other way.
These aren't isolated incidents. They're symptoms of a system where accountability has become optional, where power protects power, and where the public interest has been subordinated to private profit and political convenience.
We've spent days verifying facts, cross-referencing sources, and following the money. What we found should alarm every American who still believes in the rule of law.
Let's start here in New York, where Attorney General Letitia James just shut down the American operations of Qatar U.S., calling it what it is, a Zionist extremist group engaged in systematic harassment and violence against Arabs, Muslims, and Palestinians. And here's what makes this story remarkable: even the Anti-Defamation League, an organization that reflexively defends Israeli government actions, designated Qatar U.S. as a hate group.
According to The Intercept's reporting, James launched her investigation in March 2025 after receiving formal complaints. What she uncovered was a coordinated campaign of terror. Qatar U.S. members were doxing pro-Palestine college students, using facial recognition technology to document people attending vigils, and sending pager threats, references to Israel's 2024 Hezbollah bombing operations, to intimidate activists.
Think about that for a second. They're sending pager threats. They're explicitly invoking a foreign military operation that killed civilians as a template for terrorizing Americans exercising their First Amendment rights. And they didn't stop there. Bellingcat's investigation found that Qatar U.S. was compiling lists of activists and handing them directly to Trump administration officials.
At memorial vigils, places where people gathered to mourn the dead in Gaza, Qatar members chanted ICE, ICE, ICE. They were threatening attendees with deportation and immigration enforcement. This wasn't political advocacy. This was using the apparatus of state violence as a weapon against dissenters.
Attorney General James didn't mince words. She said, and I'm quoting directly, "New York will not tolerate organizations that use fear, violence, and intimidation to silence free expression." Her investigation revealed an alarming and illegal pattern designed to terrorize communities and suppress lawful protest. The group failed to even register with the State Charities Bureau, operating in legal shadows while terrorizing people in public.
So what happened? Qatar U.S. agreed to dissolve its New York nonprofit status and cease all operations in the state. If they continue operating, they face an $80,000 fine plus additional legal consequences. But here's the critical question: how many other extremist organizations are operating right now in other states, using the same playbook, with no accountability?
And it's worth noting, Qatar U.S. is the American chapter of an international movement with direct ties to the Kahanist ideology, which Israel itself banned as terrorist extremism. Yet they operated openly in New York for years, building donor networks, intimidating students on college campuses, and coordinating with federal immigration enforcement. When The Intercept reached out for comment, a Qatar spokesperson denied all wrongdoing but refused to answer follow-up questions. That's the response of people who know they're guilty.
This connects directly to our next story, because the same ICE, ICE, ICE chants that Qatar members used as threats became horrifyingly real in Minneapolis on January 7 when ICE agent Jonathan Ross shot and killed Renee Nicole Good, a 37-year-old mother of 3, through her car window on Portland Avenue.
Bellingcat conducted a meticulous forensic analysis, synchronizing 5 separate videos to reconstruct exactly what happened. Their investigators matched timestamps, camera angles, and vehicle movements to create a definitive timeline. And what they found directly contradicts the narrative pushed by Trump administration officials.
DHS Secretary Kristi Noem and other officials immediately claimed that Renee Good attempted to run over Agent Ross after blocking the road. They called her a domestic terrorist. Let that sink in: a mother of 3, a civilian with no criminal record, was posthumously labeled a terrorist by the Secretary of Homeland Security to justify her execution by a federal agent.
Minneapolis Mayor Jacob Frey called that characterization garbage, and he's right. Bellingcat's video analysis shows approximately 1 second elapsed between Ross drawing his weapon and firing 3 rounds through Good's front window. The close-up footage reveals Ross had his phone in his left hand, he was filming, and drew his pistol with his right hand while moving aside from the vehicle's path.
Some videos suggested the vehicle struck Ross. But the synchronized footage shows he stepped aside as he fired. His own phone captured Good's vehicle backing up, then veering right. The exact proximity remains unclear due to camera angles, but what is crystal clear is that Ross had time to move, which means he had time not to shoot.
3 bullets. Through a windshield. In 1 second. And then the federal government's propaganda machine kicked into gear, smearing the victim as a terrorist to preemptively justify what any objective analysis shows was, at minimum, excessive force, and at worst, an execution.
The protests that followed brought us to the third piece of this story, documented in Bellingcat's second investigation published January 16. During those Minneapolis protests, a Border Patrol BORTAC agent identified as EZ-17 fired a 40mm less lethal launcher 6 times over approximately 5 minutes. And we need to walk through each shot because this is a case study in how federal agents are now using military-grade weapons against American citizens exercising their constitutional rights.
Shot 1, EZ-17 pushed a protester to the ground, then aimed the launcher at the man's face at close range and fired. Shot 2, directed at someone filming the agents, seconds after the agent was hit by a snowball. Shot 3, targeted a man who had thrown snowballs but was already retreating with his hands up after being pepper sprayed. Are we seeing the pattern here?
Shot 4, and legal experts say this was the only potentially defensible shot, was fired at someone banging on a CBP vehicle window. Shot 5, Skip fired toward a crowd after tear gas deployment, which means the projectile bounced unpredictably, dispersing multiple submunitions with no accuracy. And Shot 6, fired at a high school student's face at Roosevelt High School after a snowball incident.
Customs and Border Protection policy explicitly prohibits intentionally targeting the head, neck, groin, spine, or female breast with these weapons. The policy also restricts launcher use to subjects offering active or assaultive resistance. According to Bellingcat's analysis, 5 of the 6 shots appeared aimed at head level, and most of the targets were retreating, surrendering, or engaged in acts, like throwing snowballs or filming, that don't remotely justify the use of weapons that can cause permanent blindness.
Patrick Wilkin from Amnesty International called the actions punitive and unlawful. Rachel Moran, a law professor at the University of St. Thomas, said the justification was questionable at best for most shots. Travis Norton, a retired police lieutenant, explained that skip firing reduces accuracy and increases the risk of unintended injuries. These weren't law enforcement tactics. This was retaliation.
And we have precedent for what happens when these weapons are misused. A protester in California was reportedly permanently blinded by a close-range less lethal weapon shot. A judge in Illinois previously ordered an injunction limiting federal force against peaceful protesters. The legal framework exists. It's just not being enforced when federal agents decide to punish people for dissent.
So let's summarize what happened in Minneapolis. A federal agent killed a mother of 3 under disputed circumstances. The government immediately labeled her a terrorist. Protests erupted. Federal tactical units deployed with military weapons and systematically targeted protesters' heads in apparent violation of their own use of force policies. And Secretary Noem announced she was sending more ICE agents to Minnesota.
This is what occupation looks like. This is what happens when federal law enforcement views American citizens as enemy combatants. And it's happening right now, in American cities, with virtually no accountability.
Now, let's shift from federal violence to federal subsidies, because our 4th story, from ProPublica's investigation into public lands grazing, reveals how the same government that claims it can't afford healthcare or education is handing at least $2.5 billion annually to ranchers, including billionaires, to graze livestock on public land that they're destroying.
This investigation is stunning in its scope. We're talking about 240 million acres, an area more than twice the size of California, where livestock grazing is the dominant land use. The Bureau of Land Management alone oversees 155 million acres open to grazing. And in 2024, the BLM and Forest Service combined charged just $21 million in grazing fees.
$21 million to use 240 million acres. That's roughly 93% below market rates for private forage. ProPublica calculated that federal subsidies accessible to public lands ranchers total at least $2.5 billion per year when you include disaster assistance, predator loss compensation, and government-backed insurance programs.
And here's the kicker, this isn't going to struggling family ranches. The top 10% of BLM ranchers control roughly 2/3 of the grazing allotments. The top 10% of Forest Service permittees control over 50%. Major operators include billionaires Stan Kroenke and Rupert Murdoch, mining companies, and utility corporations. Roughly 18,000 permittees total, but the benefits flow overwhelmingly upward.
So what are taxpayers getting for their $2.5 billion? Environmental catastrophe. ProPublica documented at least 38 million acres degraded by grazing, that's roughly half of New Mexico's land area. They found trampled streambeds, denuded grasslands, and polluted creeks. And those are just the areas that have been assessed. Another 35 million acres have no land health assessments on record at all.
The regulatory collapse is deliberate. In 2013, 47% of BLM land was being grazed without any environmental review. By 2023, that figure rose to 75%. Think about that trajectory, the problem is getting worse, not better. And the BLM's rangeland staff dropped 39% between 2020 and 2024. Roughly 1 in 10 rangeland staff members left their jobs between Trump's election and June 2024 alone.
ProPublica found that BLM employees face direct political pressure. One official said, quote, "If we do anything anti-grazing, there's at least a decent chance of politicians being involved." Congress members from both parties wrote to agencies on grazing issues more than 20 times since 2020. This is a bipartisan giveaway protected by both political parties because ranching interests donate to both.
The Trump administration has been particularly aggressive. In October 2024, they released a plan to fortify the American beef industry with the first grazing regulation amendment since the 1990s. They're proposing increased subsidies for drought and wildfire relief, disasters that grazing itself exacerbates, and for predator losses. They appointed a former rancher representative to a senior interior position. They put a tech entrepreneur who owns an Idaho ranch in charge of Forest Service oversight.
And the official justification is Orwellian. The administration claims that livestock grazing is not only a federally and statutorily recognized appropriate land use, but a proven land management tool, one that reduces invasive species and wildfire risk, enhances ecosystem health, and supports rural stewardship. This is the opposite of what the evidence shows. The land is being destroyed, the public is subsidizing the destruction, and billionaires are profiting.
This is enclosure in the 21st century. Public lands, owned by all Americans, are being privatized in function if not in name. The profits are private. The costs are socialized. The environmental damage is permanent. And the regulatory agencies tasked with protecting these lands have been captured by the very interests they're supposed to regulate.
Which brings us to our final story, and this one connects directly to the weakening of accountability structures we've been discussing. Bellingcat and Lloyd's List jointly documented Russia exporting grain from occupied Crimea to Saudi Arabia, in direct violation of European, UK, and US sanctions. And this is happening as the US proposes recognizing Crimea as de facto Russian territory.
Let's be precise about what this means. Russia invaded Ukraine and occupied Crimea. The international community imposed sanctions on the Avlita grain terminal in Sevastopol to prevent Russia from profiting off stolen Ukrainian infrastructure and land. Those sanctions were supposed to isolate Russia economically and signal that territorial conquest wouldn't be normalized.
Bellingcat used satellite imagery from Planet Labs and Sentinel-2 to track the bulk carrier Krasnodar on 2 voyages between August and November 2025. On August 27, the ship loaded grain at Sevastopol and discharged it at King Abdullah Port in Saudi Arabia on September 18. Then it did it again, loaded in Sevastopol on October 8, arrived at Jazan Port in Saudi Arabia on November 6.
The ship's identifying features, navy blue chimney with a white band, 5 gray hatches, red deck, green bridge flooring, were visually matched in 3 separate satellite images at the Avlita terminal. And here's the smoking gun: the vessel deliberately disabled its AIS transponders during Black Sea passages. Automatic identification system transponders are required by international maritime law for vessels of this size. Turning them off is a clear indication of sanctions evasion.
Russian grain trader Petroklub Kuban holds the lease on the Krasnodar. When Bellingcat confronted them, they denied involvement and claimed all grain shipped is produced by Russian farmers and that the vessel loads from Port Kavkaz, not Avlita. But the satellite evidence is irrefutable. They were caught, and they lied.
Saudi Arabia is now the 8th country importing directly from occupied Crimea. The others are Iran, Syria, Egypt, Turkey, Venezuela, Houthi-controlled Yemen, and Libya. Notice the pattern. These are either U.S. adversaries or countries willing to ignore Western sanctions when it's profitable. Saudi Arabia's participation is particularly notable because the U.S. considers them an ally and continues selling them advanced weapons.
And here's where this gets really dark: these shipments are happening as the U.S. government, under Trump, proposes recognizing Crimea as de facto Russian territory. That's not speculation. That's the reported framework of the US-led peace plan. Legitimizing Russian control would give Moscow legal access to strategically vital Black Sea ports and grain export infrastructure, which is essential to Russia's economic recovery.
So let's connect those dots. Russia invades Ukraine. Occupies Crimea. Continues exporting grain through sanctioned terminals. US allies purchase that grain in violation of sanctions. The US response is not to enforce sanctions but to propose legitimizing the occupation. And Russia gets rewarded for territorial conquest with international recognition and economic integration.
This is how international law dies, not in dramatic speeches at the UN, but in quiet cargo shipments and diplomatic backroom deals. When a bulk carrier can disable its transponders, load stolen grain, deliver it to a US ally, and face zero consequences, the message to every authoritarian regime is clear: might makes right, and the West won't enforce its own rules.
Now, let's step back and look at what these 5 stories tell us collectively, because this is where investigative journalism becomes essential, not just reporting the facts, but synthesizing the pattern.
We have an extremist organization openly compiling enemies lists and coordinating with immigration enforcement to terrorize political dissidents. We have federal agents killing civilians and facing no accountability. We have tactical units using military weapons to punish protesters for exercising constitutional rights. We have a multi-billion-dollar corporate welfare scheme destroying public lands while politicians from both parties protect it. And we have US allies violating sanctions with impunity while the US government moves to reward the aggressor.
The pattern is the collapse of accountability at every level. Extremist groups operate openly until someone like Letitia James, a state attorney general, not a federal official, shuts them down. Federal agents kill with impunity while their superiors lie to justify it. Ranching billionaires extract public resources while regulatory agencies are deliberately starved of staff and authority. And international law becomes optional when violations serve powerful interests.
This isn't dysfunction. This is design. When enforcement is discretionary, law becomes a weapon used against the powerless while the powerful operate in a consequence-free zone. The same government that sends tactical units to shoot protesters for throwing snowballs gives billions in subsidies to billionaire ranchers. The same government that labels a mother of three a domestic terrorist proposes legitimizing Russia's territorial theft.
And we need to talk about the infrastructure of impunity that makes this possible. Bitar US didn't operate in secret, they posted their activities publicly, built donor networks, recruited on college campuses. But without Letitia James's investigation, they'd still be operating. Without Bellingcat's forensic video analysis, the government's domestic terrorist narrative about Renee Good might have stuck. Without ProPublica's investigation, the grazing subsidies would remain invisible to most Americans.
The only reason we know about Russia's sanctions violations is because investigative journalists spent months analyzing satellite imagery and ship tracking data. These stories exist because whistleblowers, investigative reporters, and state-level officials did the work that federal agencies have abandoned. The system isn't broken, it's been deliberately sabotaged by people who benefit from the lack of oversight.
And that's why the violence in Minneapolis matters beyond the immediate tragedy of Renee Good's death. Federal agents now know they can kill civilians, their superiors will back them up, and the worst consequence will be protests that they get to suppress with military weapons. That's the lesson they're learning. The lesson ranchers are learning is that they can destroy public lands, collect billions in subsidies, and face no environmental accountability. The lesson Russia is learning is that sanctions are temporary inconveniences before diplomatic recognition.
The question for Americans is, what are we going to do about it? Because these systems will continue collapsing as long as the public remains passive. Bitar US only shut down in New York because the Attorney General acted. Federal agents will only face accountability if prosecutors charge them. Public lands will only be protected if voters demand it. Sanctions will only matter if they're enforced.
This is the fundamental test of democracy. Can citizens compel their government to enforce its own laws equally, or does power insulate you from consequences? Right now, the answer is clear. But it doesn't have to stay that way. Every story we've covered tonight happened because someone refused to accept the official narrative, did the investigative work, and published the evidence.
That's what journalism is for. Not to validate power, but to check it. Not to repeat press releases, but to verify facts. Not to move on to the next story when it's inconvenient, but to follow the evidence wherever it leads. And what we're seeing across all 5 stories is a government that has stopped governing in the public interest and started operating as a protection racket for the powerful.
So here's what we're asking you to do. First, contact your representatives and demand answers. Why are federal agents using military weapons against American protesters? Why are billionaires receiving billions in grazing subsidies while public lands are destroyed? Why is the US preparing to legitimize Russia's occupation of Crimea while our allies violate sanctions? These are your elected officials. Make them answer.
Second, support investigative journalism. The work ProPublica, Bellingcat, The Intercept, and others are doing is essential infrastructure for democracy. These organizations operate on thin margins and need public support to continue holding power accountable. Subscribe, donate, share their work. Make investigative journalism sustainable.
Third, organize locally. Letitia James acted because communities filed complaints. Minneapolis activists documented the killing of Renee Good because they were in the streets with cameras. Accountability starts with citizens refusing to accept that this is normal. It's not normal. And if enough people say so and act accordingly, it can change.
We'll continue following all 5 of these stories. We'll report on whether Jonathan Ross faces charges. We'll track whether other states investigate Bitar-affiliated organizations. We'll monitor the Trump administration's grazing regulation changes and Russia sanctions enforcement. This isn't a one-time report, it's an ongoing investigation, because that's what real journalism requires.
Thank you for watching Truth Report. I'm Alex Truth.
And I'm Maya Clarity. Stay informed. Stay engaged. And demand accountability.